Hey, my name is Nathan Reed. I'm 33 years old, and I own a small diner called the Wildwood off Route 9. Just outside Asheville, North Carolina, the kind of place with a chalkboard menu, a bell over the door that never rings quite right, and booths that have absorbed 20 years of coffee spills and quiet conversations. I never thought I'd fall in love with a woman I met because a thunderstorm broke the sky open on a Tuesday night, and she stood dripping in my doorway holding a baby who wasn't crying, which somehow scared me more than if he had been. She looked at me like she was bracing for the door to be shut in her face, and she said the strangest thing I'd ever heard from a stranger. "Please, just let us sit here until the rain stops." I want to tell you how those 11 words rearranged the rest of my life. But to understand why I said yes without even thinking about it, you have to go back further than that night. Back to the version of me who used to believe the diner would never be anything more than a place I kept open, because closing it felt like losing her all over again. 3 years before that storm, I was supposed to be planting tomatoes in the garden behind this diner with my fiancée Claire. We'd bought the place together 2 years into dating, took out a loan neither of our families thought we could pay back, and spent our nights repainting the booths a color Claire called Dusty Rose, and I called Pink. Though I never said that out loud because she'd throw a rag at me. Claire had a laugh that made strangers turn around in the street. She used to say the diner wasn't about the food. It was about giving people somewhere warm to sit when the rest of the world felt cold. I believed her completely. I still do. She died on a Sunday morning driving back from the farmer's market with a truck bed full of squash and peppers when a driver ran a red light on Tunnel Road going almost 50. The doctors told me later she probably never even saw it coming. I used to think that was supposed to be a comfort. It never was. After that, I kept the diner open because I didn't know how to close it without also closing the last place that still smelled like her, coffee and cinnamon, and the candle she used to burn behind the register. I hired a cook named Otis, an older man with a bad knee and a good heart, and a waitress named Priya who was going to community college during the day and never once complained about my silences. I worked mornings until close most days because staying busy was the only trick I had for keeping my mind from wandering somewhere I didn't want it to go. People in town got used to seeing me behind the counter with my sleeves rolled up, polite, steady, a little too quiet. Somewhere in those 3 years, I stopped expecting anything to change. I told myself that was fine. A diner doesn't need a man who's whole. It just needs a man who shows up. That Tuesday night, the sky had been building all afternoon, a green-gray color that old-timers around here call stormlight, heavy and still before it breaks. By 8 o'clock, the wind was slamming the awning against its brackets, and Priya had already gone home because her shift ended at 7, and I told her not to risk the roads. I was wiping down the counter, half listening to the thunder roll closer, thinking about locking up early, when the bell over the door jangled wrong. Too fast, too hard, like someone had pushed it open with their shoulder instead of their hand. She was standing there, soaked through a thin gray coat that had given up protecting her blocks ago, dark hair plastered flat against her face, a baby wrapped in a blanket against her chest. And for a second, neither of us said anything. I remember the water running off her in a thin sheet onto the mat by the door, and how she didn't move to come further in, like she expected me to tell her to leave. The baby made a small sound. Not quite a cry, more like a question, and she bounced him gently without even seeming to notice she was doing it. Her eyes found mine, and there was something in them I recognized immediately, though it took me a while to name it. It was the look of someone doing math in her head about how many more doors she had left to try before she ran out of nights. "Please," she said, voice barely above the sound of the rain hitting the windows. "Just let us sit here until the rain stops. I promise we won't be any trouble." I set the rag down. "Come in out of that," I said. "You're going to catch your death standing in the doorway." She hesitated, like the invitation itself was a trick she hadn't decoded yet. Then she stepped inside, and I noticed she didn't have a ring on her hand, and I noticed I'd noticed, and I told myself it didn't matter one way or another. I pulled out a chair at the booth closest to the heater vent, the one Claire used to call the good booth because it never got cold even in January, and I gestured for her to sit. She lowered herself into it carefully, still cradling the baby like the world might try to take him if she loosened her grip for even a second. "You want some coffee?" I asked. "Or something warm?" I've got soup left from lunch. Chicken and rice. She looked at me for a long moment, like she was waiting for the price to come attached to the offer. I don't have much money, she said quietly. I can pay you back for the coffee at least. I just need somewhere the baby isn't cold. I'm not going to charge a woman with a baby for sitting in a booth during a storm, I said. That's not the kind of place this is. Something in her face shifted, not quite relief, more like disbelief holding its breath. Thank you, she said. My name's Sarah. This is Micah. He's 4 months old. I'm Nathan, I said. I own this place. I'll get you that soup. I went back to the kitchen mostly to give her a minute alone, because I could see from the way her shoulders had started to shake that she was trying not to cry in front of a stranger and needed the room to do it without an audience. I heated the soup slower than I needed to. When I brought it out, her eyes were red but dry, and she thanked me twice. And I noticed the baby had fallen asleep against her chest, despite the thunder, the way babies sometimes do when they finally feel a body go still around them. You don't have to tell me anything, I said, sliding into the booth across from her, not too close. But if you need a phone or a ride somewhere once this lets up, I can help with that. She wrapped both hands around the coffee mug like it was the only warm thing left in the world. I don't have anywhere to go, she said. That's the truth of it. I left in kind of a hurry. I didn't ask why. I'd learned enough in 3 years of running a diner off a highway to know that people tell you what they need to tell you when they're ready, and pushing only closes doors that were starting to open on their own. So I just said, well, you're welcome to stay until the rain stops. And if that turns out to be a while, that's fine too. We're not going anywhere. She looked at me across the table with an expression I would spend the next several months trying to understand. Most people say something like that and mean 20 minutes. I think some part of her already suspected I meant something longer than that, and it frightened her as much as it seemed to steady her. The rain didn't stop. If anything, it got worse, the wind picking up enough that a trash can lid went cartwheeling across the parking lot outside. And somewhere down the block, a transformer blew with a flash of blue light that made her jump and curl tighter around the baby. I watched her check the door twice, like she was expecting someone specific to walk through it, and both times her whole body tensed before she made herself relax again. You keep looking at the door, I said gently. Somebody looking for you tonight? She didn't answer right away. Outside, thunder cracked close enough to rattle the window glass. Finally, she said very quietly, his grandmother wants him. Not visit him, have him. And she has the kind of money that makes wanting into having if you're not careful. I didn't understand the whole shape of it yet, but I understood enough. I understood a woman running from someone who thought a baby could be filed away like paperwork. And I understood the particular exhaustion of a person who's been made to feel like she doesn't have the right to keep what's hers. I thought about Claire, about all the things people had said to me in the weeks after the funeral. Well-meaning and cruel in equal measure, about how a man alone couldn't keep a diner running. Couldn't keep anything running, really. I knew what it was to have people decide what you could and couldn't hold on to. You can stay here tonight, I said. There's a room above the kitchen, used to be storage, but there's a couch up there and it's dry and it locks from the inside. Nobody's going to bother you here. Her eyes filled again, and this time she let the tears fall. I don't even know you, she said. No, I agreed. But I know what it looks like when somebody's run out of places to be scared in private. You can be scared here. Nobody's going to make you explain yourself tonight. She didn't say anything else for a long while. We just sat there, the storm working itself out against the windows, the baby breathing slow and even against her chest. And something about the quiet between us didn't feel awkward the way silence with a stranger usually does. It felt like two people who had both learned, in different ways, how much weight a person can carry before they stop admitting they're carrying it at all. That first night, she slept upstairs with Micah, and I sat behind the register long after closing, not really doing anything, just being present in case she needed something and didn't want to come find me. In the morning, she came down looking like she hadn't slept much, hair pulled back, wearing the same damp coat because it was the only one she had. And she found me already at the griddle making eggs. You didn't have to do that, she said. I like an excuse to cook something other than diner food, I said, which wasn't entirely true, but it made her almost smile, and that felt like a small victory worth chasing again. Over the next few days, the story came out slowly, The way things do when someone's been holding their breath for a long time and finally lets a little air escape at a time. Micah's father, a man named Preston Callahan, had died in a small plane crash 4 months before Micah was born, before they'd married, before he'd even told his family Sarah existed, because his mother, Vivian Callahan, ran a real estate empire across 3 states and had very particular ideas about who belonged in the family and who didn't. Sarah had grown up 2 towns over in a trailer park with a mother who worked 2 jobs, and Preston had loved her anyway, had promised her it wouldn't matter what his mother thought once they were married. He never got the chance to prove it. After he died, Vivian found out about the baby through a lawyer's letter Sarah sent asking for nothing but acknowledgement. And instead of grief, instead of grandmotherly warmth, what came back was an attorney's demand for a paternity test, followed by a custody claim built on the argument that Sarah, unmarried, unemployed since the pregnancy, living in a rented room above a laundromat, was unfit to raise a Callahan heir. Vivian's lawyers had shown up at Sarah's door twice already, once with papers, once with cash, both times implying that if Sarah wouldn't hand the baby over quietly, they had the resources to make her life difficult enough that she'd wish she had. The night of the storm, a car had parked outside her building for 2 hours with its lights off, and Sarah had grabbed Micah and left with nothing but a diaper bag and whatever cash she had, walking until she found the first place with a light on and no crowd behind the glass. "I'm not stupid," she told me one evening, sitting in the good booth with Micah asleep in the portable bassinet Otis had found somewhere in his garage and brought over without being asked. "I know how this looks. Woman with no ring shows up with a baby and a sob story. I know people are going to think I'm after something." "I don't think that," I said. "You don't know me," she said again, like she needed to keep saying it until one of us believed it enough to stop being kind. "I know enough," I said. "I know you sat in my diner 3 nights running and never once asked me for $1 you didn't offer to pay back. I know you feed that baby before you feed yourself every single time. That tells me plenty." She looked down at her hands, and I noticed for the first time how tired they looked. Chapped and thin, hands that had been doing more work than they should have had to for longer than they should have had to. I asked if she wanted a job, and I meant it as exactly what it sounded like. Nothing hidden underneath. Priya could use the help on weekend mornings, I told her. And there was still that room above the kitchen, and I wasn't using it for anything but boxes of napkins nobody needed. It wasn't charity, I said, because I'd learned from watching Claire that people don't want to be rescued, they want to be useful. They want a door that opens because they knocked on it themselves. Sarah cried again when I offered, but this time it didn't look like grief. It looked like something loosening in her chest that had been clenched for a very long time. The weeks that followed found their own rhythm, the way weeks do when 2 people start building a life around each other without quite naming what they're building. Sarah worked mornings, moved with Micah into the room above the kitchen, which Otis and I fixed up on a Sunday with a second-hand crib and a coat of paint the color of a robin's egg because Sarah mentioned once, almost embarrassed, that she'd always wanted a nursery that color. She was a natural with the customers, remembered orders after hearing them once, made the regulars laugh in a way I hadn't managed in 3 years. Micah started recognizing my voice before he recognized much of anything else, and I found myself walking through the kitchen at odd hours just to catch a glimpse of him sleeping in the little bassinet Priya kept behind the counter during Sarah's shifts. I told myself I was helping because it was the right thing to do. It took me longer than it should have to admit that wasn't the whole truth. One night, closing up together, Sarah asked me why I never talked about myself. And I found myself telling her about Claire for the first time all the way through. The diner, the tomatoes we never planted, the drive home from the farmer's market that ended everything. Sarah didn't try to fix it. She didn't offer platitudes about time healing or things happening for a reason. She just listened. And when I finished, she reached across the counter and put her hand over mine and said, "She sounds like she'd have liked what you did for us." I didn't have an answer for that except to nod because my throat had closed up in a way it hadn't in a long time. But the peace didn't last, because peace like that rarely does when someone like Vivian Callahan has decided she isn't finished. It was a Saturday, the diner half full with the regular lunch crowd. when a black car with tinted windows pulled into the lot and a woman stepped out wearing a coat that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage on the building. She walked in like she already owned the place, scanned the room, and found Sarah behind the counter with Micah in the bassinet at her feet. The whole diner seemed to feel the temperature drop. "Sarah," she said, voice smooth and cutting all at once. I have to say I expected something a little more discreet than a truck stop diner. Sarah went pale but didn't back away from the counter. "Mrs. Callahan," she said. "What are you doing here?" "I think you know exactly what I'm doing here," Vivian said. And then her eyes moved to me, sizing me up the way you'd size up an obstacle rather than a person. "And who is this? The new boyfriend? Convenient, isn't it, that you found a man with a business right as my lawyers started asking questions about your fitness to raise my grandson alone?" I felt something in my chest go still and cold in a way it hadn't since the day I got the call about Claire. I stepped around the counter, not fast, not aggressive, just present, standing close enough to Sarah that Vivian would understand exactly whose side of this conversation I was on. "Ma'am," I said, my voice steady even though my pulse wasn't, "I don't know what business you have with Sarah, but you're welcome to sit down and have a cup of coffee like anyone else, or you're welcome to leave. What you're not welcome to do is stand in the middle of my diner and talk to her like she's something you're deciding whether to purchase." Vivian's eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of surprise in them too, like she wasn't used to being spoken to without flinching. "I don't think you understand who you're dealing with," she said. "I understand exactly who I'm dealing with," I said. "I'm dealing with a grandmother who lost her son and decided the fastest way to feel like she hadn't lost anything else was to take his child away from the woman who's raising him with everything she has. That's not love, ma'am. That's grief wearing love's coat." The diner had gone quiet enough that you could hear the coffee machine hissing behind the counter. A couple of the regulars had turned in their booths. Vivian's jaw tightened, and for a second I thought she might actually leave without another word. But instead she looked at Sarah and said very quietly, almost gently, in a way that was somehow worse than shouting would have been, "You will not win this. I have the money and the lawyers to make sure that child grows up with the life he deserves, whether or not you're a part of it." Sarah's hands were shaking, but her voice, when it came, was steadier than I'd ever heard it. "He already has the life he deserves," she said. "He has a mother who would give up sleep and food and pride for him without blinking. If you want to be part of that life, you're welcome to. But you don't get to buy him away from me, and you don't get to walk into the place that's given us shelter and talk to the man who's shown us more kindness in a month than your family showed us in a year." Vivian's mouth pressed into a thin line. "We'll see what a judge has to say about shelter," she said, and turned on her heel, and walked out, and the black car pulled away, and the diner exhaled all at once, and somebody at the counter started clapping, quiet at first, and then Otis joined in from the kitchen doorway, and Sarah stood there with tears streaming down her face, not from fear this time, but from something that looked almost like being seen for the first time in longer than she could remember. There was a night before all that, though, that I think about almost as often as the storm itself, because it was the night I understood exactly how much was at stake, and how little control either of us actually had over it. Sarah had gone quiet for 2 days, the kind of quiet that isn't peace, but is instead a person holding something heavy behind their teeth. And when I finally asked her what was wrong, she showed me a voicemail on her phone. Vivian's voice, calm and precise, saying that she'd learned Sarah had moved a man into the child's living space within a year of losing his father, and that any judge in the state would see exactly what that looked like on paper. Sarah's hands were shaking when she played it. "I'm going to lose him," she said. "Not because I've done anything wrong, but because she can make it sound like I have. That's what money does. It doesn't have to be true. It just has to sound true to the right person in the right room." I didn't have an answer that would fix that, not that night. So I did the only thing I could think to do, which was sit with her on the floor of the little room above the kitchen until the panic in her breathing slowed down, and remind her over and over that whatever happened, she wasn't going to face it by herself. Not the paperwork, not the hearing, not the long nights before it. Somewhere around midnight, she finally fell asleep sitting up against my shoulder, and I stayed awake a long while after that, watching Micah's chest rise and fall in the crib Otis and I had built, thinking about how strange it was that I'd spent 3 years believing I had nothing left to protect, and now I had more to protect than I'd ever had in my life. and I was terrified of losing it in a way I hadn't let myself be terrified of anything since the phone call about Claire. The court papers came 2 weeks later. Vivian Callahan was formally petitioning for custody, citing Sarah's lack of stable income prior to working at the diner, her lack of permanent housing prior to moving into the room above the kitchen, and, absurdly, the fact that she was now living with a man she wasn't married to as evidence of an unstable environment for a child. I read the filing twice, standing at the counter after closing, and something in me went very quiet and very determined. I called a lawyer the next morning, a woman named Denise Whitfield, who Otis knew from church, sharp and unshowy in a way that reminded me of Claire, and she told me the truth plainly. Vivian had resources. What Sarah had was harder to fake. A record of steady work, a stable home, a community that would show up for her, and a paper trail proving every claim in Vivian's filing was either outdated or outright false. The months before the hearing were long. Sarah worked her shifts and studied for a certification in early childhood care at night because she said if a judge was going to question whether she was equipped to raise her son, she wasn't going to leave any question unanswered. Denise gathered statements from Priya, from Otis, from 3 regulars who'd watched Sarah with Micah every week, from Father Alvarez down the road who'd started seeing them at Sunday service. I fixed up the lease on the room above the kitchen to make it official, a real address, a real rent agreement, small as it was. Somewhere in those months, without either of us deciding it out loud, Sarah and I stopped being 2 people who happened to live in the same building and became something neither of us had a name for yet, though everyone else in town seemed to have already decided what to call it before we did. There's a version of this where I tell you the falling in love was dramatic, a single moment you could point to, but it wasn't like that. It was smaller than that and somehow bigger. It was Sarah leaving a mug of coffee on the counter exactly the way I liked it before I'd even come downstairs. It was me learning to hold Micah so he'd stop crying during the worst of his teething, some trick with rocking and humming that Claire's mother had taught me years ago for a cousin's baby, and that I hadn't thought about since. It was the night Micah said something that might have been Dada and might have just been sound. And Sarah looked at me across the kitchen with an expression somewhere between panic and hope. And I said, without planning to, "He can call me that if it's all right with you." And she didn't answer with words. She just crossed the kitchen and kissed me, soft and certain. And something in my chest that had been locked for 3 years came open like a window finally letting in air. "I love you," I told her that night, sitting on the floor of the little room above the kitchen with Micah asleep between us. I didn't expect to. I wasn't looking for it, but I do. She was quiet for a long moment. And I worried I'd said it too soon, but then she said, "I think I started falling in love with you the first night. When you didn't ask me a single question before you brought me soup. I've spent my whole life being told what I deserved by people who never once asked what I needed. You just asked what I needed." The hearing was held on a gray Tuesday morning in a courtroom that smelled like old carpet and coffee gone cold. Vivian arrived with 2 lawyers in suits sharper than anything the room deserved. Sarah wore the one good dress she owned, navy blue, and held my hand so tightly under the table that I could feel her pulse hammering against my palm. Denise laid out the case plainly: the steady work, the stable home, the community of people willing to stand up in court and say they'd watched Sarah pour everything she had into raising her son well. Vivian's lawyer argued unstable beginnings, an unmarried household, a life built too quickly around a man Sarah had known less than a year. The judge, a woman with tired eyes and a voice that didn't waste words, listened to both sides without giving anything away. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she stood and her voice shook at first and then steadied, the same way it had in the diner the day Vivian walked in. "I know what this looks like on paper," she said. "A woman with no money, no ring, no family behind her, showing up somewhere new and building a life fast because she didn't have another choice. But I have never once, not for a single day since Micah was born, put anything before him. Not my pride, not my comfort, not my fear. I have worked every job I could find. I have gone without so he wouldn't have to. And when I finally found a place that was safe, I built a life there. Not because it was convenient, but because it was the first place that ever treated both of us like we were worth keeping. If loving someone who's earned it counts against me, then I don't know what kind of fitness this court is really asking about." The judge was quiet for a long moment after that, and then she asked me to speak, since my name had come up so often in the filing. I stood, and I looked at Vivian, who was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between contempt and something almost like grief. "Your Honor," I said, "I lost the woman I was supposed to marry 3 years ago, and for a long time I didn't think I had anything left to offer anybody. Sarah and Micah walked into my diner on the worst night of a storm, and they didn't ask me for a single thing except a dry place to sit. Everything since then, the job, the room, whatever this is between Sarah and me, it happened because two people who'd both been knocked down decided to help each other back up. I'm not trying to take Micah's place in any family. I'm just trying to be one more person in his life who shows up. I don't think that should count against his mother. I think it should count for something." The judge ruled 2 weeks later. Custody remained with Sarah, full and unshared, with the note in her written decision that Mrs. Callahan's petition appeared in the court's judgment, motivated less by the child's welfare and more by an inability to accept that her son's choices had continued to matter after his death. She recommended, but did not require, that any relationship between Micah and his paternal grandmother be built slowly on Sarah's terms, if Sarah chose to allow it at all. Vivian did not contest the ruling further. I heard much later secondhand through Denise that she'd sent a card on Micah's first birthday, nothing more, and Sarah had kept it. Unopened in a drawer, not out of spite, she told me, but because some doors take longer to decide about than others. We got married the following spring, a small ceremony in the lot behind the diner. String lights hung between the porch posts Otis and I had built the week before. Micah in a little suit that made him look like he was attending his first business meeting rather than his mother's wedding. Priya cried through the whole thing and blamed it on allergies. Father Alvarez officiated, and when he asked if anyone objected, the only sound was the wind moving through the maple trees at the edge of the lot. And I remember thinking that even the quiet felt like it was on our side. In my vows, I told Sarah that I used to think the diner was the last piece of Claire I had left, the only thing keeping her memory alive, and that I'd been afraid for a long time that loving anyone else would mean losing that. But somewhere in the last year, I'd learned that love doesn't work like a room with only so much space in it. It expands. Claire gave me a place that taught me how to make people feel welcome, and Sarah and Micah were the ones who reminded me why that mattered in the first place. I told her I wasn't just choosing her. I was choosing to keep showing up every single day. The way she'd shown up in a doorway soaked to the skin and asked for nothing but shelter. Sarah's vows were shorter, and she said them looking straight at me instead of down at the paper in her hands. "You didn't rescue me," she said. "I want to be clear about that, because I spent a long time being angry at the idea that I needed rescuing. What you did was simpler than that and harder than that. You just refused to let me believe I was alone. Every single day since that storm, you've kept refusing. I don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough for that, so I'm just going to keep showing up too, for as long as you'll have me." 2 years after that storm, we added a second bedroom above the kitchen because our daughter Grace was born that winter, named for reasons Sarah understood without me having to explain them fully. Micah calls me Dad now without hesitation, the word settling into our house like it had always belonged there. The diner is busier than it's been in years, partly because people around here like a good story and ours has made its way through every booth in town, but mostly, I think, because Sarah brought back something the place had been missing since I lost Claire, a kind of warmth that isn't about the food at all. Some nights, after we've closed up and the kids are finally asleep, Sarah and I sit in the good booth by the heater vent, the one that never gets cold even in January, and we don't say much of anything. We just sit there the way we did that very first night, except now the silence between us isn't full of fear. It's full of everything that came after. People ask me sometimes how a storm and a stranger and a baby who wasn't even crying turned into an entire family, and I tell them the truth, which is that I don't think it was the storm that did it. I think it was 11 words spoken by a woman who expected to be turned away and wasn't. "Please, just let us sit here until the rain stops." I think about that sentence more than almost anything else in my life, because it taught me that sometimes the biggest thing you can offer somebody isn't a rescue at all. It's just a door that stays open a little longer than it has to, and a chair that's still warm when they finally sit down. If you've ever been the one standing outside in the rain wondering if anyone would let you in, I hope you find your version of that door. And if you've ever been the one who gets to open it, I hope you take the chance, because you never know whose whole life is waiting on the other side of that single small yes.